Hello again, and welcome to the Daily Bread Bible Study. We are looking at Wednesday, January 15th, 2020, the final chapters of Genesis, chapters 47 through 50. So we are wrapping up and tying up loose ends here in the book of Genesis. And this is the last day that we will get to look at the story of the patriarchs here in the book of Genesis. We're going to transition into Exodus, the Exodus narrative next time. And now we're going to learn how the Israelites become slaves, and all of Egypt for that matter. We'll look at wrapping up some loose ends, and then we will lean upon our faith as we see God's grace work through forgiveness to bookend the back part of Genesis. So before we get in looking at everything today, we need to wrap up a comment I made last time, something that confused me and I looked into a little bit. So we ended chapter 46 with Joseph giving advice to his family. In Genesis 46, 33 and 34, the last two verses, it says, "When Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth until now, both we and our ancestors, in order that you may settle in the land of Goshen, because all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians.'" So Jacob's telling his brothers that you should, say that you are servants, keepers of livestock. The term used there is Greek, in the Greek is cattle. And so it's a little confusing for me. Is he telling them to say that they are keepers of cattle explicitly, or just keepers of farm animals? So since he uses the term explicitly, I thought he was telling them to avoid talking about sheep at all. But upon reflection and looking at the parts around it, I believe the term cattle is used generically, which is why both the NIV translation and the NRS translation both come up with the word livestock. So it was something I thought was more there, but it is not. Joseph is just telling his family to emphasize the part about being shepherds so that Pharaoh will be forced to settle them outside the walls in the town or in the area of Goshen. So Pharaoh wants to keep his people away from the sheep because they are abhorrent. And the Israelites will have some independence because of this kind of unexpected benefit. Now, the downside could be that the Egyptians will begin to detest the Israelites for working with sheep, and we will see that detestable theme come up in the very first part of Exodus. And that'll be tomorrow. So Pharaoh, he talks with the five brothers and asks them what their occupation, and they say in Genesis 47:3, "And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds as our ancestors were.'" They commit to being shepherds of sheep. Pharaoh takes the information well and has no signs of detesting them for being shepherds. He permits them to inhabit the land of Goshen as they plan. Pharaoh then even invites them to caretake for his cattle, his beast of burden, and has a blessed interaction with Jacob. Now, I will say this is, going back earlier on, we talked about Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we see here now that a descendant of Shem, which is Jacob, is getting blessing a descendant and getting blessed by a descendant of Ham, a descendant of Ham in Egypt, which would be Pharaoh. So there's all these family connections still going on. It's still, people in this area are still connected and interconnected with the heritages, and so they are very much connected through relationships with one another. So I I just meditate on this, for the biblical narrative, especially thinking about the ways in which that in Genesis chapter 9, verses 24 and 26, we see we'll go back and revisit the cursing of Ham, the cursing of Canaan, as it is called. So when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan," or Ham, "lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Okay? Slaves. He also said, "Blessed by the Lord God, blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." So here we have it set up that Canaan would be Shem's slave, but also by virtue of that, Ham, who is the one who has his name, is the one who is also supposed to be cursed through that little interruption there in Genesis chapter 9. So it's kind of a strange text, as we've already talked about in previous days, but even stranger still is how this is kind of a reversal of that. You see the descendants of Shem will actually be the slaves to the descendants of Noah's youngest son. Call him Ham, call him Canaan. I know there's a distinction, but for the purposes of looking at this narrative study, that we can see that there's kind of a juxtaposition of this this reversal of fortunes. So yeah, there's all sorts of family connections going on here, and I think it's important to keep those in mind as we are looking at this story. So moving back to the focus of our story, we see that the famine in Egypt becomes so severe that the people of the land have to do something desperate. They have to go to Joseph and request more food, and they pay money, and then the money goes because the famine continues, and they have no more money to be able to give to Joseph. And so that's when they decide that, well, how could we pay you? Let's exchange livestock, be able to sell off some of our livestock, and then you get the livestock and we'll get some food to be maintained. And so they do that for a while, and then they run out of food again, and the famine is still going on. And they think next, finally, what do we have to offer? We have no money. We've got no livestock. I guess the only property we have is land. And even still, they have to offer up their bodies as well. And that's in verse 18, 47:18. So in this way, this is explaining how Pharaoh comes to be the owner of all of the property around Egypt. He is the owner of everything in this area, with the exception for the priests, because we'll see that for both the Levites in the Israelite community, that they are not allowed to own property, but at the same time that they are taken care of by their other tribes of Israel. And this model may in fact be from the Egyptian model, where apparently the priests were taken care of by Pharaoh. So Pharaoh, in order to keep everything going, he institutes a 1/5 tax in exchange for keeping people fed and alive. Remember that 1/5 exchange was what they were doing when the years of plenty were around. They were taking 1/5 of the produce and storing it away for a future rainy day, or lack of rainy day, that is. And so we see here in Genesis 47:25 through 26, we catch the words that talk about this enslavement. So, the people of Egypt, they said, "You have saved our lives, and may it please my Lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph, on behalf of Pharaoh, made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day. Which day is it? Moses can help us out figuring out what day it would be in their time a little bit later, but It stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priest alone did not become Pharaoh's. So there it just sums it up. After all this discussion about how they become slaves in Egypt, along with the other Egyptians as well too, Jacob gets his family in order. He had Joseph swear to not bury him in Egypt when he passes away. And then he makes Joseph's children have equal shares / be tribes along with Jacob's other 11 brothers. But remember again that since the priests don't own land, they don't get land distributions. So the tribe of Levi become the priest, and they will not get land when they come into the promised land and obtain it. So Jacob then blindly blesses the two sons of Joseph, and he blesses Ephraim before Manasseh. He blesses the younger son before the oldest son, which continues with the tradition of the younger son getting blessed instead of the oldest son. So that birthright blessing is given to the youngest son in the stories in Genesis for sure. And we will look up and see how coming up later that this leads to King David, the youngest of the house of Jesse, that he will be the one who gets blessed and gets anointed king instead of his brothers or any of the older brothers that he has. So this whole reversal and blessing of the younger is a theme that will continue through a thread that will tie in through the scriptural, especially the Old Testament. So we see that has happened with Isaac. Isaac inherits the blessing instead of Ishmael, Jacob instead of Esau, Joseph instead of his brothers, and now Ephraim instead of Manasseh. So there are just a few examples of what I'm talking about. Chapter 49. In chapter 49, we see now for something a little different. We see more poetic form of language instead of just straight narrative. And we see this kind of either these blessings or songs or song blessings or hymns or prayers. I'm not exactly sure what to call this poetic form, but we have a breakdown of each of the 12 tribes of the Israelites, the 12 tribes of Israel, sons of Jacob. And Jacob from his mouth gives kind of a description of each of the sons and what he sees with them for their past and their future. So he starts with his oldest going down the line, and he starts with Reuben. And he says that Reuben is unstable and shall no longer excel for sleeping with Bilhah in Genesis 35:22. That random line there where he was talking about Reuben was sleeping with his father's concubine. And so that Jacob remembered that, and that plays into the whole firstborn birth right, not being distributed as one would think. Simeon and Levi, he talks about them as brothers of anger and violence. And just remember, these two brothers went and slew the Hivites in the midst of Dinah being raped. So, Jacob, disappointed with Reuben, disappointed with the way Simeon and Levi brought ill reputation upon him, and then moves down to the next oldest one, which is Judah. Now, Judah is very important. Not only was he the spokesman to Joseph and trying to plead with Joseph for Jacob and for Benjamin's sake, but he is the ruler. So he is the line through which the Jews will come. He is the line through which King David will come. He is the line in which we as Christians will receive Jesus as well. So he is a very important line for the whole Bible. And we will see how when the time of the United Kingdoms, where the tribe of Israel basically comes together under one nation, and they live in the promised land, and they even get a king over themselves. The kings will come from the tribe of Judah. So the ruler is what he is called. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, as it says in Genesis 49:10. And he goes on and on and on with a long length describing Judah. And then Zebulun. Poor Zebulun. One line, one verse only. Talking about living by the sea, working on the sea, having a seaside manor, and done. Issachar talks about how he will be forced into labor. Dan goes on to talk about he will judge his people, and he has an analogy of a snake by the roadside. So not a very nice analogy. Gad, he talks about a raider of raiding. Asher, he talks about rich food. Naphtali, he talks about beauty and how a beautiful doe will produce beauty. And then he comes to Joseph, which he spends more time on, comparing Joseph to a fruitful tree, talking about the ways in which Joseph suffered through, the assault that I would say through like arrows, the imagery of bows and arrows, and the resilience that he practiced in staying firm, and the ways in which that he is blessed and will be a blessing further. And then for Benjamin, he connects him with a ravenous wolf. So after finishing, Jacob then instructs his sons to bury him by Mamre with his ancestors, and he finally dies. So let's pick it up in the final chapter, chapter 50. See that Joseph has Jacob's body embalmed and asks leave from Pharaoh to go bury Jacob by Mamre in Canaan. As they return, Joseph's brothers worry Joseph may still hold a grudge against them. And they instruct him that Jacob had actually said to forgive them. I'm not sure. It was not recorded anywhere before this, so it's a little skeptical in my mind of whether or not he did that. But regardless of whether Jacob said it, Joseph preserves life again by extending grace to their guilt. Picking up Genesis 50 towards the end in verse 19 through 21. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. I think that's a good note to end on and to wrap up Genesis with as well. We see these two things right here at the end, which have been present in the beginning and will continue on through our narrative even in Exodus and beyond. First, we have the blessings and salvation of God, intending good even in the midst of human dysfunction and human suffering. And the second is similar. Joseph making his descendants promise to take him out of Egypt into the promised land. So the destination of the promised land is set and will be continued, and we will pick that up in Exodus tomorrow. So thank you for joining me again.